For 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lived inside a dream of its own making, a dream reinforced by victory after victory, by enemy fleets shattered before they could respond, and by a belief, quiet at first, then absolute, that the Pacific War had already been decided in Japan's favor. From the decks of Japan's aircraft carriers, the world appeared orderly, predictable, and obedient to Japanese will, a vast ocean across which power could be projected almost without resistance, and where each new operation confirmed the assumption that Japanese naval aviation stood not merely ahead of its adversaries, but on an entirely different plane of existence. This confidence did not emerge from arrogance alone. It was built upon experience. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier pilots had demonstrated a level of coordination, precision, and aggression that stunned the world, crippling the United States Pacific Fleet in a single morning and validating years of doctrinal development centered on the decisive power of carrier-based airstrikes. In the months that followed, the WWII, the first air fleet, moved across the Pacific and Indian Oceans like a force of nature, striking the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Ceylon, and countless lesser targets, dismantling Allied resistance with an efficiency that bordered on contemptuous. British capital ships were sunk by aircraft alone. American airfields were erased in hours. Enemy pilots died by the hundreds, while Japanese losses remained astonishingly light. For the men who served aboard Japan's fleet carriers, this unbroken chain of success produced not merely confidence, but a profound sense of inevitability, the belief that victory was not something to be achieved through continued effort, but a condition that already existed and merely needed to be formalized. Within the Japanese Navy, this psychological state acquired a name, shoribyo, victory disease. It was a condition that distorted perception, discouraged dissent, and transformed assumptions into unquestioned truths, among them the conviction that Japanese fighting spirit was inherently superior, that American sailors lacked resilience, and that no enemy force could withstand a properly executed Japanese carrier strike. By the spring of 1942, the WWII had become more than a naval formation. It was a symbol. 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, formed the core of a weapon system unlike anything the world had seen, crewed by pilots who had survived the brutal attritional air war over China and refined their skills through constant operational experience. They could launch over 100 aircraft in minutes, coordinate complex strike packages without radar, and recover their planes with clockwork precision, a display of maritime aviation mastery that even their enemies privately admired. To the officers aboard these ships, the American Navy appeared clumsy by comparison, its carrier doctrine immature, its pilots undertrained, and its ships poorly coordinated, a force that relied on material abundance rather than tactical brilliance, and which had been decisively humbled at Pearl Harbor. The belief that the United States lacked the will or competence to challenge Japanese naval supremacy became deeply ingrained, reinforced by intelligence assessments that consistently underestimated American recovery efforts and overstated the psychological impact of early defeats. Yet beneath this surface of confidence, not all voices within the Japanese command structure were convinced. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, harbored a far more sober understanding of the war's trajectory, shaped by his years of study and service in the United States, where he had observed firsthand the scale of American industry and the latent power of its economy. Yamamoto understood that Japan's early victories had been achieved within a narrow window of opportunity, before American industrial capacity could be fully mobilized, and that once this mobilization reached maturity, Japan would face an opponent capable of replacing losses at a rate it could never hope to match. To Yamamoto, the Doolittle raid of April 1942, when American bombers struck Tokyo itself, was not militarily significant, but psychologically devastating. For it revealed that American carriers remained operational, aggressive, and willing to take risks, undermining the illusion of Japanese control over the Pacific. The raid convinced Yamamoto that the war could no longer be delayed or managed incrementally. The American carrier force had to be destroyed outright. And so, from within a culture intoxicated by victory, emerged a plan designed to deliver one final, decisive blow. A plan that would draw the American fleet into a trap so elaborate, so comprehensive, that escape would be impossible. That plan was Operation MI, and it would carry the Imperial Japanese Navy to the edge of absolute triumph, and then over the precipice. If the Kido Butai represented the apex of Japanese naval power, then Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto represented its single most perceptive mind, a strategist who understood that the true theater of war extended far beyond the decks of carriers, far beyond the reach of aircraft, into the factories, shipyards, and industrial complexes of an opponent whose latent strength dwarfed the resources of even the most formidable Japanese fleet. Yamamoto understood that the stunning victories of December 1941 and early 1942 were as much a product of timing and surprise as they were of Japanese ingenuity or valor. In his private assessments, he warned that Japan's window of opportunity was closing with every month, that the industrial behemoth across the Pacific, which seemed lethargic and ineffectual at Pearl Harbor, would soon awaken, and when it did, the sheer scale of its production, logistics, and manpower would render Japanese preeminence fleeting. This awareness weighed heavily on him, not only as a commander, but as a student of modern warfare. Unlike many of his colleagues, Yamamoto appreciated that a fleet's effectiveness in battle was not merely the sum of its ships, aircraft, and trained personnel, but also the product of sustained operational capacity. A superior vessel in perfect condition could be neutralized if the enemy could simply outproduce, outrepair, and outlast it. He saw with unnerving clarity the limits of relying solely on skill, bravery, and daring tactics. When the Doolittle raid struck Tokyo in April 1942, it crystallized his fears. That audacious attack, carried out by 16 Army bombers launched from a carrier over an incredible distance, demonstrated that the Americans had recovered, adapted, and were willing to strike at the heart of Japan itself. It was not the material damage that shocked him. The physical destruction was limited, but the symbolic implication: the Americans were not defeated, not demoralized, and not incapable of counteraction. The raid also revealed vulnerabilities in Japan's defensive perimeter. If American carriers could project power hundreds of miles from the home islands, then Japan's own expansion across the Central and South Pacific was increasingly precarious. Forward bases, outposts, and critical islands were no longer isolated bastions, they were targets. And Midway Atoll, a seemingly minor speck in the vast Pacific, now loomed as the linchpin of American strategy, its capture essential to securing Japan's defensive perimeter and eliminating any remaining threat to the inner defensive ring surrounding the home islands. Midway's value was both strategic and psychological. Geographically, it sat at a critical point along the route between Japan and Hawaii, capable of serving as a staging point for reconnaissance and strike missions, a forward observation post that could warn of American movements or host forces to interdict enemy attacks. Psychologically, the possession of Midway would signal Japanese dominance, reinforcing the myth of invincibility that had already permeated the fleet and the public consciousness. With these considerations in mind, Yamamoto conceived Operation MI, a plan designed to draw out and annihilate the remaining American carrier strength in a single decisive blow. The operation was a masterpiece of coordination on paper, a feint against the Aleutians to divert attention, a central strike against Midway to bait the Americans, and the full concentration of Japan's carrier fleet positioned to intercept and destroy whatever force arrived to defend the island. The planning process, however, was inherently fragile. It relied on multiple fleets operating hundreds of miles apart, precise timing, perfect communications, and flawless execution under conditions where chance, weather, and human error could introduce chaos at any moment. Success depended not merely on the skill of individual pilots, but on the synchronization of hundreds of men, scores of ships, and thousands of aircraft, a system of such complexity that its failure could be catastrophic. Compounding this risk was Japanese overconfidence in intelligence security. The Imperial Navy firmly believed that its ciphers, its operational secrecy, and its radio discipline made the fleet invisible. They were wrong. Unknown to them, American codebreakers had cracked JN-25, the primary naval cipher used to coordinate fleet movements. Analysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had deduced the target of the next Japanese operation, confirming it with a clever ruse. Midway sent a false message reporting a shortage of fresh water, and the Japanese intercepted and relayed the information back exactly as intended, unwittingly validating American suspicions. While the Japanese fleet sailed under the illusion of invisibility, Admiral Chester Nimitz had already begun positioning his carriers for a counter-ambush, an extraordinary gamble of his own, relying on incomplete intelligence, limited forces, and the audacity of timing to confront a superior fleet that expected to surprise its opponent instead. The stage was set. A clash not only of fleets, but of expectations, assumptions, and the hidden currents of human error and misjudgment. Yamamoto's strategy was audacious because it attempted to compress the advantage of Japanese superiority into a single operation that would deliver a knockout blow, a decisive statement meant to cement dominance. But in doing so, it amplified risk. The very elements that made the plan brilliant on paper, its complexity, its reliance on perfect coordination, and its assumption of unchallenged execution, were the same elements that made it brittle. A single failure, a moment of hesitation, a miscalculation in timing, or an unforeseen action by the Americans could unravel the entire design. Thus, by the morning of June 4, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy approached Midway in a state of confidence bordering on hubris. The Kido Butai was at the absolute height of its power, carriers fully manned and armed, veteran pilots at peak readiness, and 6 months of operational dominance reinforcing the belief in inevitable victory. Yet beneath the polish of preparation and the roar of aircraft engines, an invisible thread of uncertainty stretched taut, unseen and unappreciated by the fleet's officers, a thread that, if broken, would unravel the myth of invincibility and deliver one of the most stunning reversals in military history. By the early hours of June 4, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already deep into the execution phase of Operation MI, a plan that had been meticulously coordinated for months, yet was fragile in ways no diagram could convey. From the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the carriers of the Kido Butai appeared invincible, a cohesive strike force capable of projecting hundreds of aircraft across the Pacific with clockwork precision. Yet the brilliance of the plan was inseparable from its vulnerability. Multiple fleets were dispersed over hundreds of miles of open ocean, each with specific objectives, each dependent on the flawless timing of the others. Any disruption, delays in reconnaissance, mechanical failures, pilot fatigue, or misinterpretation of orders could cascade into disaster. This was the invisible risk embedded in Operation MI, a structural weakness that relied on perfect execution in an environment where uncertainty was the only certainty. From the perspective of Japanese intelligence, confidence had replaced caution. The Imperial Navy's cryptographic system, JN-25, had been regarded as unbreakable, and radio silence had been strictly enforced to prevent detection. Japanese officers trusted implicitly in the security of their communications, unaware that Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, under Commander Joseph Rochefort, had already cracked the majority of the code. American analysts had confirmed Midway as the target, using a combination of deduction, deception, and field reconnaissance. The Japanese fleet sailed into a trap without even realizing it. The operational plan was further complicated by Nagumo's orders and the rigidity of Japanese doctrine. Carrier doctrine demanded that airstrikes be launched in coordinated waves, with fighter escorts always accompanying bombers. Separate strikes or piecemeal attacks were considered tactically unsound, almost heretical. But in practice, this meant that any deviation, any need to alter armament, or any reconnaissance report indicating unexpected enemy movement required painstaking adjustments that consumed precious minutes, minutes that would soon prove fatal. The complexity was compounded by logistical constraints. Each carrier had a finite number of aircraft, which had to be armed and fueled according to the target type. Bombs for Midway were not the same as torpedoes intended for enemy ships. Switching ordnance mid-operation required physically moving heavy torpedoes and high-explosive bombs across crowded hangars, threading them through narrow passageways while dozens of other aircraft were being prepared simultaneously. The decks became an intricate ballet of men, fuel, ordnance, and machinery, and one misstep could trigger a catastrophe. Even before the first planes launched, Japanese reconnaissance failures foreshadowed disaster. Planned scouting flights over Pearl Harbor and the Aleutians had been canceled or delayed. A submarine picket line meant to detect enemy movements was deployed too late. By the time the first reports arrived, the American carriers were already in position, invisible to Japanese eyes, but fully aware of the unfolding situation. Nagumo, operating with incomplete and conflicting information, faced decisions that would soon define the battle. The psychological dimension of the operation was equally significant. Japanese officers believed in their own superiority, but they also feared dishonor. Hesitation, even in response to new intelligence, was perceived as weakness, a potential stain on the carrier command ethos. Nagumo's caution, his strict adherence to doctrine and the cultural imperatives of the Navy, reflected not indecision alone, but a strict adherence to doctrine and the cultural imperatives of the Navy. Yet this same caution would prove catastrophic when confronted by the audacity and speed of American attacks. At dawn on June 4th, the first wave of aircraft was launched toward Midway. 108 planes, operating with the precision drilled into them by months of training and experience, formed an aerial hammer aimed at neutralizing the island's defenses. It was a display of technical perfection, takeoffs executed in seconds, formation flying precise to the second, navigation along pre-planned paths, and armament configured for maximum effect. The initial strikes inflicted damage on Midway, but the island was not neutralized. American airfields remained operational, and some forces had survived to launch counterattacks. From the Japanese perspective, the unexpected persistence of enemy resistance introduced a dilemma. Nagumo had prepared reserve aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs to attack American carriers once located, but the incomplete intelligence meant he could not yet commit these forces. Orders to swap ordnance were issued, halted, and reversed repeatedly as conflicting reconnaissance reports arrived from different scouts. Meanwhile, the Americans executed their countermeasures with precision born not from raw technical superiority, but from preparation, calculation, and the foresight of code breaking. Yorktown, hastily repaired after the Coral Sea battle, was fully operational and part of a small but strategically positioned counterforce. Nimitz had gambled on the placement of his carriers, using the Japanese belief in their invisibility against them. The Kido Butai, for all its efficiency and power, was now a victim of its own structure. The intricate plan, designed to deliver decisive victory, became brittle under the weight of minor delays and miscommunication. The time spent rearming planes on crowded hangar decks delayed the Japanese response at the exact moment that American scout planes, flying undetected, identified the fleet and set the stage for the coming assault. Every element of the operation, from intelligence to logistics, from doctrine to reconnaissance, coalesced into a single, unavoidable truth. Perfection in isolation could not withstand the pressure of adaptive, informed opposition. And yet, aboard the Japanese carriers, the officers remained largely unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. Confidence, training, and prior success blinded them to the fragility of their position. By 7:30 a.m., the stage was set for the battle's turning point. The Japanese carriers were exposed, planes in disarray on the hangar decks, ordnance being shifted and reconfigured, engines idling for launch, while unseen above them, American dive bombers approached from out of the sun. The invisible calculus of timing, luck, and decision-making, which had seemed a minor factor in months of previous victories, was about to become the decisive determinant of fate. By 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the morning mist hung low over the Pacific, and the four Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through calm waters with the smooth authority of a predator unconcerned with its prey. On the flight decks, engines idled, pilots prepared, and hangars buzzed with the controlled chaos of hundreds of men moving ordnance, fueling aircraft, and checking instruments for what was meant to be a flawless strike on Midway Island. At precisely this moment, the first wave of Japanese planes began their climb, a formation of over 100 aircraft, including bombers, torpedo planes, and their ever-present Zero escorts. Each pilot carried not only weapons, but the weight of expectation, confidence, and a belief in the inevitability of victory. From the bridge of Akagi, Commander Nagumo watched the ascent with satisfaction, imagining the destruction to come. Yet Midway was not neutralized. American anti-aircraft fire, though primitive by Japanese standards, disrupted bombing runs, and some airfields remained operational. Reports from scout planes filtered back. Resistance was greater than anticipated. Nagumo faced an impossible choice. The reserve aircraft aboard the carriers were armed for a different target, the American carriers themselves. But switching ordnance to match this new information required rearming planes in congested hangars, moving heavy torpedoes and bombs, all while hundreds of other aircraft occupied the same decks. Orders were issued to rearm for a naval strike, then halted, then partially reversed as conflicting reports arrived. The hangar decks became a maze of motion and confusion. Men struggled to lift torpedoes, secure bombs, and fuel aircraft. This physical chaos mirrored the mental and strategic chaos occurring in Nagumo's command decisions. Strike now, or wait for coordination, expose carriers to risk, or preserve planes for a future counterattack. As the hours passed, the first glimmers of disaster emerged in the form of a late reconnaissance report. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone sighted an approaching American force, 3 carriers, not 2 as the Japanese had assumed, and possibly more. Nagumo's hesitation, guided by doctrine and a desire to strike with full strength, now became fatal. Time, which had been an ally during the previous months of Japanese triumph, was now a relentless enemy. Then, at 10:20 a.m., the sun itself betrayed them. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared descending from 20,000 feet, completely undetected, out of the blinding sun. 30 dozen SBD Dauntless aircraft screamed toward the Japanese fleet, poised to release their payloads with terrifying precision. On the decks below, Japanese sailors had no warning, no time to react. The hangars were crowded with planes, loaded with fuel and ordnance, engines warming for launch, while unseen above them, American dive bombers approached from out of the sun. The invisible calculus of timing, luck, and decision-making, which had seemed a minor factor in months of previous victories, was about to become the decisive determinant of fate. By 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the morning mist hung low over the Pacific, and the four Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through calm waters with the smooth authority of a predator unconcerned with its prey. On the flight decks, engines idled, pilots prepared, and hangars buzzed with the controlled chaos of hundreds of men moving ordnance, fueling aircraft, and checking instruments for what was meant to be a flawless strike on Midway Island. At precisely this moment, the first wave of Japanese planes began their climb, a formation of over 100 aircraft, including bombers, torpedo planes, and their ever-present Zero escorts. Each pilot carried not only weapons, but the weight of expectation, confidence, and a belief in the inevitability of victory. From the bridge of Akagi, Commander Nagumo watched the ascent with satisfaction, imagining the destruction to come. Yet Midway was not neutralized. American anti-aircraft fire, though primitive by Japanese standards, disrupted bombing runs, and some airfields remained operational. Reports from scout planes filtered back. Resistance was greater than anticipated. Nagumo faced an impossible choice. The reserve aircraft aboard the carriers were armed for a different target, the American carriers themselves, but switching ordnance to match this new information required rearming planes in congested hangars, moving heavy torpedoes and bombs, all while hundreds of other aircraft occupied the same decks. Orders were issued to rearm for a naval strike, then halted, then partially reversed as conflicting reports arrived. The hangar decks became a maze of motion and confusion. Men struggled to lift torpedoes, secure bombs, and fuel aircraft. This physical chaos mirrored the mental and strategic chaos occurring in Nagumo's command decisions: strike now or wait for coordination, expose carriers to risk or preserve planes for a future counterattack. As the hours passed, the first glimmers of disaster emerged in the form of a late reconnaissance report. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone sighted an approaching American force, 3 carriers, not 2 as the Japanese had assumed, and possibly more. Nagumo's hesitation, guided by doctrine and a desire to strike with full strength, now became fatal. Time, which had been an ally during the previous months of Japanese triumph, was now a relentless enemy. Then, at 10:20 a.m., the sun itself betrayed them. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared descending from 20,000 feet, completely undetected, out of the blinding sun. 30 dozen SBD Dauntless aircraft screamed toward the Japanese fleet, poised to release their payloads with terrifying precision. On the decks below, Japanese sailors had no warning, no time to react. The hangars were crowded with planes, loaded with fuel and ordnance, engines warming for launch, while unseen above them, American dive bombers approached from out of the sun. The invisible calculus of timing, luck, and decision-making. The Japanese carriers had been designed for offense, not survival. Their enclosed hangars, which had allowed rapid launches and compact efficiency, became death traps when fuel and ordnance ignited. Their speed and coordination could not compensate for vulnerability. The very doctrines and efficiencies that had delivered 6 months of unbroken victories now amplified their catastrophe. And while American losses were significant, they were survivable. Yorktown would be repaired again, pilots replaced, and operational carriers would remain in the field. Midway, the atoll itself, survived. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time, Japanese invincibility had been shattered in a single crushing blow. By sunset, the Pacific bore the scars of that day. 3 carriers destroyed, 1 crippled, thousands of men dead, and the myth of invincibility reduced to ashes. Japanese propaganda would later claim victory, but within the Naval High Command, the truth was undeniable. The strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the United States. As the sun set over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the waters around Midway were littered with the remnants of the Japanese fleet, smoldering wreckage, floating fuel drums, and the scattered, lifeless forms of hundreds of men who had once embodied the apex of naval power. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a defeat so complete that it transcended mere loss of ships or aircraft. It struck at the heart of confidence, doctrine, and the very culture that had fueled their unbroken victories. In the immediate aftermath, the Japanese leadership faced a stark reality. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were gone. Hiryu, the last surviving carrier of the Kido Butai, had been located and destroyed within hours. Over 3,000 sailors, pilots, and aircrew were dead. Veteran pilots with years of experience and countless victories had perished, leaving the fleet devoid of irreplaceable skill. These were not just losses in materiel, they were the erosion of institutional expertise, of the very nerve center of Japanese naval air power. Yet the cultural response was remarkable. Publicly, the Japanese government presented Midway as a victory, a heroic engagement in which the Imperial Navy had displayed courage and honor. Families of the survivors were sworn to secrecy. The fates of lost ships were omitted from official rosters, obscured by bureaucracy and deliberate misdirection. Within the military, a culture of denial took hold. Mistakes in planning, flawed intelligence, rigid adherence to doctrine, and hesitation in the face of uncertainty were never openly acknowledged. To admit failure was, in the eyes of the hierarchy, to admit moral weakness. This denial carried profound consequences, lessons that could have been learned, the danger of overcomplexity, the need for adaptive leadership, the vulnerability of doctrine when confronted with unforeseen circumstances remained unexamined. Japan would continue to fight without fully confronting the weaknesses that Midway had exposed. The Imperial Navy's capacity to innovate under pressure, to adapt to changing conditions, was compromised by the very culture that had celebrated their early triumphs. For the United States, by contrast, the victory at Midway marked a turning point. The 3 carriers lost at Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had been avenged. The strategic initiative in the Pacific passed irrevocably to the Americans. The combination of intelligence, preparation, audacity, and the willingness to exploit Japanese assumptions had delivered a triumph disproportionate to the forces involved. In the months and years that followed, Midway became a blueprint for operational success. Anticipate, adapt, and leverage every advantage, whether technological, human, or strategic. For historians and strategists, the lessons of Midway are manifold. Overconfidence, no matter how justified by prior success, can blind a force to emerging threats. Complexity in planning, while often seductive on paper, can magnify errors under real-world conditions. Rigid adherence to doctrine can be fatal when flexibility is required. And finally, the human dimension, the courage, ingenuity, and decisiveness of individual actors can alter outcomes even in engagements that seem dictated by material or numerical superiority. From the perspective of the man aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the battle was over in minutes, but the consequences would echo for decades. Entire carrier air groups vanished in a few harrowing moments. Commanders who had trained for years, perfected their tactics, and relied on the cohesion of their units found that a single unforeseen variable, the appearance of dive bombers out of the sun, guided by intelligence they could not detect, had undone all their preparation. In 5 minutes, the apex of Japan's Pacific power was shattered, and the course of the war was altered forever. Midway's story, however, is not merely a tale of loss. It is also a story of perspective, of how preparation, adaptability, and intelligence can triumph over assumptions, overconfidence, and technological superiority. It demonstrates that in warfare, as in life, timing, awareness, and the willingness to act decisively under uncertainty can outweigh even the most impressive material advantages. So as we look back on June 4, 1942, from both sides of the conflict, we are reminded that battles are never won on paper and victory is never guaranteed. The Kido Butai, once thought invincible, learned this lesson too late, and the Americans, seizing the moment with courage and calculation, demonstrated the enduring power of preparation, innovation, and adaptability. Here's my question for you. If you were in Nagumo's position, facing conflicting intelligence and impossible choices, what would you have done differently? Would you have acted immediately or waited for perfect coordination? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this story changed the way you think about history, warfare, or the fine line between victory and defeat, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more untold stories from the past. Thank you for watching. The story of Midway reminds us that even the mightiest forces can fall in moments, and that preparation, intelligence, and adaptability are the real weapons of survival. Until next time, keep exploring the hidden truths of history.